A millionaire mistakes a single mother for a waitress, but what she revealed left him speechless. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Enjoy the story. The sound of clinking silverware and hushed conversations filled the elegant ambience of the Grand Oak, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York. Nathan Carter strode in with measured steps, his impeccable suit and cold gaze making it clear he was a billionaire accustomed to being served without question. He despised wasting time. That evening's business dinner was just another insignificant obligation in his overcrowded schedule. Taking a seat at his reserved table, he tapped his fingers against the marble surface while checking his platinum Rolex. No waiter in sight, and then he saw her. Emily Parker stood near the counter, holding an envelope with the receipt for the takeout order she had placed. Her long chestnut hair cascaded in loose waves, and she wore dark jeans and a simple blue blouse. Exhausted after a long day working at the bookstore, she just wanted to grab her dinner and head home, where Jake, her 6-year-old son, was waiting for her. Nathan frowned, growing impatient. "Can you bring me a whiskey, neat?" He ordered without even lifting his eyes from his phone. Emily blinked, startled, glancing around to make sure he was actually speaking to her. "Excuse me?" He huffed, barely raising his gaze to shoot her a look of disdain. "The service here keeps getting worse. Are you going to take my order or not?" Emily's blood boiled. The audacity of this man was unbelievable. Crossing her arms, she lifted her chin. "Maybe I'd bring you a glass of water." To the face. Nathan arched an eyebrow, intrigued by her boldness. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he assumed was a waitress. "Do you always treat customers this way?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emily let out a dry laugh. "I'm not a waitress, but if I were, I'd serve you with exactly the amount of respect you deserve." None. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Nathan's eyes, surprise, maybe even a sliver of admiration. But his arrogance quickly returned. "Interesting," he murmured, studying her as if trying to figure her out. Emily rolled her eyes, grabbed her order, and left without looking back. But just before crossing the door, she felt a strange shiver run down her spine, as if that encounter, no matter how insignificant it seemed, had altered the course of her life in some way. Little did she know that fate would soon bring them together again, and this time, with a truth capable of shaking the very foundations of Nathan Carter's world. 2 days had passed since the restaurant incident, and Emily Parker hadn't spared another thought for that arrogant man. Her focus was on something far more important, making sure Jake, her 6-year-old son, had everything he needed. Harper's Books, the bookstore where she had worked for 3 years, was her sanctuary. Surrounded by the comforting scent of paper and coffee, she felt a peace she couldn't find anywhere else. But on that cold New York afternoon, fate decided to toy with her. The glass door swung open, and the soft chime of the entry bell announced a new customer. Emily was behind the counter, organizing some notes, when she heard firm footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. "I need a book on corporate crisis management. Something that's not just theory, but filled with practical examples." The deep, authoritative voice made her heart stop for a second. She lifted her gaze slowly, and her stomach twisted. Nathan Carter was standing right in front of her. He looked just as impeccable as before, dark suit, commanding presence, sharp eyes. But unlike last time, there was a faint trace of surprise on his face, as if he hadn't expected to run into her either. Emily took a deep breath and forced a professional smile. "Second shelf to the right. There's an entire section on business and management." Nathan didn't move right away. He studied her with an intense look, as if trying to fit her into a logic that made sense. "You don't work at the restaurant?" he asked, clearly puzzled. Emily crossed her arms, holding back a laugh at the irony. "No, but thanks for the reminder." Nathan hesitated, a brief flicker of discomfort crossing his expression. He wasn't a man who apologized easily, but something about Emily's unwavering stance made him feel small, and he didn't like that feeling. "I was wrong about you. You don't even know me well enough to be right or wrong." She arched an eyebrow. "Now, if you need help choosing a book, I can call someone." Nathan let out a small sigh, as if he wasn't used to being treated with such indifference. Something about her intrigued him. She wasn't impressed by his presence, nor did she make any effort to be pleasant. She was different. "I'll manage." Emily nodded and went back to her work, but she could still feel the weight of his gaze on her. "Nathan Carter is just another customer," she told herself. "Just another man who will cross my path and disappear soon after." Or so she thought, because in just a few weeks he would re-enter her life, and this time there would be no ignoring him. That night, Emily took longer than usual to fall asleep. No matter how hard she tried to push the unexpected encounter with Nathan Carter out of her mind, his image kept resurfacing. The confused look, the slight hesitation when he realized he had misjudged her, but none of it mattered. He was a stranger, a man who, in her world, should remain in the past. Meanwhile, across the city, Nathan sat in his luxury apartment, staring at the glass of whiskey on his glass-top table. The encounter at the bookstore wouldn't leave his mind. Emily Parker. He repeated the name mentally, trying to understand why this woman unsettled him so much. He didn't believe in coincidences, and his instincts told him there was more to this story. So he did what he did best. He sent someone to investigate. Days later, Nathan was in his company's office when he received the report he had ordered. Seated in his imposing leather chair, he opened the envelope with the precision of a man accustomed to getting answers for everything. But as he read through the information on Emily Parker, his expression hardened. Single mother, a 6-year-old son, no record of the father. Nathan drummed his fingers against the desk. Something didn't add up. He knew all too well the type of woman who tried to get close to men like him, but Emily was clearly not one of them. She didn't try to impress him, didn't seek his attention. On the contrary, she went out of her way to keep him at a distance. And then came the detail that made his stomach twist. Emily Parker lived in Brooklyn Heights, the same neighborhood where, a little over 6 years ago, he had spent a single night with a woman whose face he had never been able to forget. His heart skipped a beat. Couldn't be. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily was folding Jake's clothes when she heard his cheerful voice. "Mommy, Mr. Nathan is nice, isn't he?" Her body stiffened. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Jake was playing with his toy cars, distracted. "The man from the bookstore. He was nice that day when he talked to you." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Her son had no idea of the storm those simple words had just unleashed inside her. Nathan Carter might be many things, but one fact remained unchanged. He was Jake's father, and he didn't know it. But at this rate, it wouldn't be long before he found out. The crisp autumn wind blew through the streets of Brooklyn Heights, scattering orange leaves across the sidewalks. Emily held Jake's hand firmly as they walked toward the bookstore. Her heart had been restless ever since she had seen Nathan again. Had he recognized her? Did he suspect anything? She tried to push those thoughts away when she suddenly felt Jake let go of her hand and run excitedly toward the curb. "Jake, be careful," she called out, but it was too late. The boy tripped as he stepped onto the curb and fell to his knees, letting out a small cry of pain. Emily rushed to him, panic rising in her chest. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Her voice was shaky as she helped him sit up. Before she could check the injury, a tall shadow loomed over them. "Is he all right?" Emily recognized that voice before she even looked up. Her body tensed as she saw Nathan Carter kneeling beside them, genuine concern written all over his face. Jake blinked up at the man, confused as to why his mother suddenly seemed so tense. "I just scraped my knee. It's nothing, mister," the boy said, trying to sound brave. Nathan looked at him and gave a small smile. Even so, we should clean it up. Come on, let's go inside the bookstore. There's a first aid kit there. Emily hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to be around Nathan longer than necessary. But Jake was already holding the billionaire's hand, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She felt a lump form in her throat. If Nathan knew the truth. Inside the bookstore, Jake sat on the counter while Nathan grabbed the first aid kit. "You're a tough little guy, huh?" Nathan said as he opened the small bottle of alcohol. Jake grinned. "My mom says I'm strong like a superhero." Emily watched the scene in silence, her heart tightening. Nathan was being kind, so different from the cold, arrogant man she knew. He took out a Band-Aid and carefully placed it on the boy's knee. "There, good as new." Jake looked at the bandage, then back at Nathan with a curious expression. "Are you a doctor?" Nathan chuckled. "No, I run companies." The boy tilted his head, intrigued. "Then why do you always look so serious?" Emily's eyes widened, and she covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Nathan, caught off guard, blinked a few times before allowing a small smile, something rare for him. "I guess I need to work on that." Jake nodded as if he were a wise old man. "Yeah, you do." Nathan looked at Emily at that moment, and for a brief instant, something passed between them. A silent connection, a recognition, and that's when he noticed Jake's eyes, the exact same shade as his. The realization hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. Emily saw the shift in his expression and knew something had awakened inside him. Her blood ran cold. Time was running out. Soon, Nathan Carter would start asking the questions she feared the most. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to answer them. Nathan Carter walked out of the bookstore with his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in years, his mind was in complete turmoil. Jake's curious gaze lingered in his thoughts, along with the unsettling feeling exploding inside him. The resemblance was undeniable. It wasn't just the eye color, a blue-gray hue identical to his own. It was the facial features, the way the boy furrowed his brow when he was thinking, even the defiant way he spoke. Nathan had never believed in coincidences, and this most definitely wasn't one. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Her body was tense, her thoughts spiraling. Nathan had noticed. She had seen the doubt in his eyes, the flicker of recognition. She wanted to believe he would brush it off. That a man like him, a billionaire buried in global business affairs, wouldn't have the time or interest to connect the dots. But deep down, she knew she was only fooling herself. So when her phone rang the next day and Nathan Carter appeared on the screen, she knew the moment she had dreaded had finally arrived. She answered, taking a deep breath. "We need to talk." His voice was firm, direct. Emily swallowed hard. "We have nothing to talk about." "I think we do." The pause on the other end of the line was heavy with tension. "About Jake." Her chest tightened. "I'm not doing this over the phone." "Great. Dinner with me tonight. 7 o'clock. He wasn't asking. He was deciding. Emily hesitated. If she refused, he might show up at her door. He didn't seem like the kind of man who took no for an answer. Fine. And she hung up before she could change her mind. The restaurant Nathan had chosen was sophisticated and discreet, far from the public eye and media attention. Emily arrived precisely at 7, finding him already seated at the table, an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him. Nathan's eyes followed her as she sat down, and for the first time, she noticed something different about him, a quiet restlessness. "I'll get straight to the point," he said without preamble. "Jake is my son, isn't he?" Emily felt her stomach twist. Her throat went dry. She could lie, deny it, run, come up with something, anything. But she had spent years protecting Jake because of lies and broken promises. So, she took a deep breath and said the only thing she could. Yes, the silence that followed was deafening. Nathan Carter was a man in complete control. But in that moment, sitting there, he looked like the ground had just disappeared beneath him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice was no longer cold. It was low, laced with something Emily couldn't quite identify. She clenched her fingers around the napkin. "You don't remember me, do you?" Nathan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "6 years ago, one night in a hotel in Brooklyn. You left before the sun came up, without so much as a name." He paled. The memory hit him like a flash. He had been on a business trip, frustrated over a deal that had fallen through. He went to the hotel bar, met a woman, and spent the night with her. An intense, fleeting connection. When he woke up, he left without looking back. He never knew her name, and now she was sitting across from him, telling him that a child had come from that night. Nathan Carter, a man used to controlling everything, suddenly found himself speechless. The silence between them was thick, heavy as lead. The quiet clinking of silverware and hushed conversations around the restaurant felt distant, muffled by the storm raging inside him. Jake was his son. His son. It was an undeniable fact, but some part of Nathan still refused to accept it. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "This is a joke, right? You actually expect me to believe that after 6 years, out of nowhere, I suddenly have a son?" Emily leaned forward, her eyes burning with fury. "I don't expect anything from you, Nathan. I never did. Then why are you telling me now?" His voice was cold, sharp, a defense against the panic clawing at his insides. Emily pressed her lips together, holding back the sting of pain. "Because you figured it out on your own. Because sooner or later the truth was bound to come out." Nathan clenched his fists on the table. He felt deceived, manipulated. "You hid this from me for 6 years. Emily lifted her chin, refusing to back down from his anger. "And if I had told you, Nathan, what would you have done?" He opened his mouth to answer but found himself without one. 6 years ago, he hadn't been a man ready to be a father. His life revolved around business, wealth, and power. His world was built on contracts, mergers, and numbers. There had been no room for a child. Emily saw the hesitation and nodded. "That's exactly why I never looked for you. You were a man who couldn't even stay in the same place for a whole night. I did what was best for my son." Nathan ran a hand over his temples, feeling the war between anger and guilt raging inside him. "I had the right to know." Emily crossed her arms. "You can't demand something you were never willing to give. You never wanted commitment, Nathan. You never wanted a family. So I moved on." He stared at her, his jaw clenched. Everything inside him screamed that this was wrong, that he had never been given a choice. And that was what killed him. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "I want a DNA test." Emily rolled her eyes. "Seriously? After looking at Jake, you still have doubts?" Nathan held her gaze. "I need to be sure." She closed her eyes for a second. He hadn't outright called her a liar, but the demand felt close enough. Still, Emily had nothing to hide. "Fine, I agree. But know this, Nathan." She leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "If that test confirms what I already know, you'll have to decide what you're going to do." He studied her for long seconds, and Emily saw the war in his eyes. Nathan Carter had always been a man who made the rules, but this time he was about to lose control of the game, and she knew that terrified him. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions Emily would rather not relive. The DNA test had been scheduled quickly, as expected from a man with the power and influence of Nathan Carter. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. Emily took Jake to the clinic without telling him the real reason. She simply said it was a routine checkup, and, as always, the boy trusted her without question. Nathan was there, serious, tense, watching everything in silence. A small strand of Jake's hair was collected and sent for analysis. And then the agonizing wait began. Nathan buried himself in work, trying to ignore the knot tightening in his chest. But it was useless. Every night, he found himself staring at the ceiling, recalling every detail about Jake. The way he furrowed his brow when concentrating. How he spoke with conviction, unafraid. How his eyes reflected something so familiar it almost hurt. Deep down, he already knew the truth, but he needed to see it in front of him. 3 days later, Emily received the call from the clinic. Her heart pounded. The test results are ready. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. And the doctor hesitated before answering. Nathan Carter is, without a doubt, Jake Parker's biological father. Emily felt her legs weaken, even though she had expected that answer. She thanked the doctor and hung up, gripping her phone tightly. For a moment, her world seemed to shrink. She was no longer in control of the situation. Now, everything depended on Nathan. That night, she went to his office. This time, she was the one who wanted a meeting. Nathan greeted her standing, his back to the window, hands tucked into the pockets of his suit jacket. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Emily placed the envelope with the test results on his desk. The proof you wanted. Nathan didn't reach for the papers. He didn't need to. Instead, he let out a bitter laugh and ran a hand down his face. I lost 6 years. Emily felt a painful tightness in her chest. I know. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with something she hadn't expected to see: pain. I wasn't ready back then, Emily, but that doesn't mean I would have walked away. She studied him, trying to distinguish between what was true and what was just belated regret. There's no point thinking about what could have been. What matters is now. Nathan nodded, but his expression remained dark. And now, what happens? Emily took a deep breath. That depends on you, Nathan. Jake doesn't know who you are. I built a life for him, a life without you. So before you make any decisions, ask yourself, do you really want to be his father? Or is this just wounded pride? Silence stretched between them. Nathan looked away for a moment, but when his gaze returned to hers, there was no more doubt in his expression. I want to know him. For real. Emily felt her heart race. Nathan Carter was about to step into Jake's life, and that would change everything. Nathan Carter wasn't a man who made empty promises. When he said he wanted to get to know Jake, Emily could tell he meant it. But saying the words was one thing, being a father was something else entirely. In the days that followed, Nathan tried to get closer, but Emily remained cautious. She knew Jake was a sweet, hopeful child, and the last thing she wanted was for him to get attached to someone who could disappear from his life as quickly as he had appeared. That's why she set rules. You can see him, she said as they walked through the park on a chilly autumn afternoon. But no big revelations. To him, you're just Nathan. Nathan stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing. You want me to hide the fact that I'm his father? Emily crossed her arms, standing firm. I want you to prove that you're going to stay before you turn my son's world upside down. Nathan held his breath. He had never had to prove anything to anyone. But here was Emily Parker, demanding something he wasn't sure he could offer: commitment. He stared at her for long seconds before slowly nodding. All right, whatever you want. But deep down, he knew this battle was only just beginning. The first interaction between Nathan and Jake happened naturally. Emily brought her son to a cafe near the bookstore, and Nathan was already there, waiting. Jake looked at the tall, serious man sitting at the table and blinked. Hi, Mr. Nathan. Nathan, a man used to negotiating with cold, calculating businessmen, suddenly found himself completely disarmed by the innocence of this little boy. Hey, champ. Jake grinned and climbed onto the chair next to him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emily watched the scene, her chest tightening. Want some orange juice? Nathan asked, signaling the waiter. Jake shook his head. I like hot chocolate, but my mom says I can only have it sometimes. Nathan smiled. Good to know. Then, out of nowhere, Jake tilted his head and asked, Are you my mom's friend? Emily tensed. Nathan tensed. But Jake simply waited for an answer, innocent and curious. Nathan glanced at Emily before replying. "I'm trying to be." The boy seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to focusing on his hot chocolate, completely unaware that he had just ignited a spark in his mother's heart. As Nathan and Jake interacted more, Emily couldn't ignore the tightness in her chest. What if Nathan got tired of this? What if all of this was just temporary guilt? She had seen him give orders and walk away from million-dollar deals without blinking. He was a man used to controlling everything. But being a father wasn't something you could control. So one night, she went to his office again. "I need to know," she said, crossing her arms. "Why are you doing this?" Nathan leaned back in his chair, exhausted, his eyes locked onto hers. "Because I lost 6 years, Emily, and I'm not going to lose another minute." Emily felt her throat tighten, but words wouldn't be enough. She needed to see actions. And deep down, she was terrified of what would happen if she started trusting him. Days turned into weeks, and against all her expectations, Emily began to notice something surprising. Nathan didn't give up. He wasn't a perfect father, he didn't even know how to be one. But he tried. Nathan didn't just show up for his scheduled visits with Jake. He made an effort to truly be present. He took the boy for ice cream after school, sat through his favorite cartoons without complaining, and even taught him how to tie his shoelaces, something Emily had been trying to do for months. It was a shock to realize that Jake, innocent and fearless, already saw Nathan as someone important. "Mr. Nathan is nice." "Huh, Mommy?" Jake asked one night as he brushed his teeth. Emily hesitated, her heart tightening. "He is, sweetheart." And that was the most terrifying truth of all. Because if Nathan were just an arrogant, cold-hearted man, it would be easy to keep him at a distance. But now she was starting to let her guard down. One night, after putting Jake to bed, Emily found Nathan waiting for her outside the bookstore. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emily crossed her arms, hesitant. "About what?" "About us." Her stomach twisted. "There is no us, Nathan. You're getting to know your son, and that's already more than I ever expected." Nathan took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "But you still don't trust me." Emily let out a tired sigh. "You've been here for weeks, Nathan. But what happens after that? You've always had the world at your feet. What happens when this gets hard? When Jake expects something from you, and you don't know how to handle it?" Nathan was silent for a long moment. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But her heart still remembered the pain of waking up alone 6 years ago, of him leaving before the sun had even risen. "Don't make promises you can't keep." Nathan studied her, and for the first time he looked vulnerable. "This time I won't fail." Emily didn't respond, because part of her wanted to trust him. But the other part was still afraid of getting hurt again. And the worst part? She knew that sooner or later, she would have to make a choice. And this time, her heart was on the line. Time passed, and Emily saw something she never imagined she would. Nathan Carter was changing. Nathan was no longer just the cold, arrogant billionaire she had met at the restaurant. He was no longer the man who disappeared before dawn. Now he was present. Jake adored Nathan. That much was obvious. The boy talked about him constantly, drew pictures of the two of them together, and one night, without realizing the weight of his words, he asked, "Mommy, do you think Mr. Nathan wanted to be my dad?" Emily felt her chest tighten. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Jake smiled. "I think so, because he always comes back. He always comes back." Those words echoed in Emily's mind, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. But could she trust it? The real test came weeks later when Nathan had to leave town to close a major deal. Emily saw the hesitation in his face when he told Jake he'd be gone for a few days. "I'll be back before you know it, champ," Nathan said, ruffling the boy's hair. But when Jake simply replied with an indifferent "okay," Emily knew he was protecting himself. Jake had learned far too young that people leave. Emily waited, watched, and deep down, She feared this would be the moment Nathan finally gave up, but he didn't. The following night, as she was tucking Jake into bed, her phone buzzed. Nathan Carter had sent a message. "Can you put me on speaker?" Emily hesitated before answering and did as he asked. "Hello?" Jake mumbled sleepily. Nathan's voice came through, gentle yet steady. "That scares me too," he admitted, his voice low yet steady. But he didn't step back. Emily searched his face, looking for hesitation, doubt, anything that would make this easier. But all she found was certainty. Nathan Carter, the man who once ran from anything that resembled permanence, was standing before her, proving with every action that he was no longer that man. She exhaled shakily, still feeling the warmth of his lips lingering on hers. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Nathan cupped her face again, his touch gentle but firm. "Then we'll figure it out together." Her heart clenched at his words. She had spent years protecting herself, shielding Jake from disappointment, convincing herself that she could handle everything on her own. But for the first time, she didn't feel so alone. She didn't feel like she had to carry it all by herself. Nathan had changed. Not just in words, not just in gestures, but in the way he showed up. Again and again, never retreating, never hesitating. Emily closed her eyes for a moment before nodding. "Okay," she said softly. Nathan smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Okay." And just like that, the walls between them began to crumble. As the city lights flickered around them and autumn leaves swirled in the breeze, Emily took the first step towards something she never thought she'd allow herself to have. A chance. A chance at love. A chance at family. And for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't afraid to hope. "Me too. But I won't fail you. Not ever." A few days later, the sun shone brightly over the park as Jake ran toward Nathan, clutching a small paper airplane. The boy looked up at him with pure innocence. No fear, no hesitation, no walls. And then, without warning, he reached for Nathan's hand and said, with complete simplicity, "I love you, Dad." Nathan felt his heart clench, as if every wall he had ever built had finally crumbled. Life had given him millions, power, success, but nothing compared to this moment. He knelt before his son, gripping his small hand tightly. "I love you too, champ." Emily, watching from a short distance, felt tears welling in her eyes. They were a family, finally, and in that instant, she knew Nathan Carter would never leave again.